Optimal health for high performers. This is the Health Upgrade Podcast with Dr. Nawaz Habib.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Health Upgrade Podcast. This is Dr. Habib, and I'm here with JP. How are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm great. This episode of the Health Upgrade Podcast is brought to you by Truvaga. Have you been looking for a simple way to feel calmer, think clearer, and sleep better? Imagine achieving this with just 2 minutes a day. I'm excited to introduce you to Truvaga, a handheld device that supports your nervous system through gentle vagus nerve stimulation. As a doctor specializing in functional health and wellness, I've seen firsthand how Truvaga has accelerated healing in my clients. I've used this device to help people with a range of issues, from sleep disturbances and heart palpitations to digestive dysfunction, nervous system imbalances, and mental wellness concerns. The results have honestly been remarkable. Truvaga is designed to catalyze and accelerate the shift in your body from fight or flight to rest, digest, and recover mode, helping you manage stress, maintain mental clarity, and unwind more easily. It's not just theory. I've witnessed its positive impact on real people facing real health challenges. The best part? Truvaga fits seamlessly into your routine. No need to carve out hours for wellness. Just 2 minutes a day can make a difference. It's a small investment of time for potentially significant benefits in how you feel and function each day. If you're curious to experience Truvaga for yourself, visit truvaga.com/upgrade. You can save $30 on your device by using the code UPGRADE30 at checkout. Remember, that's truvaga.com, truvaga.com/upgrade. It might just be the first step towards a calmer, clearer you, just as it has been for many of my clients. So today's conversation, we're going to dig into a topic that has some controversy around it. There's arguments to be made, and I think very reliably so on both sides. And I think this is one that will be of interest to a lot of people because salt, which is our topic for today, gets a lot of heat in the media and has been...
It's a salty topic.
It's a very salty topic. This is something that gets a lot of, maybe I'll say unwarranted negative attention. And I think there are specific markers, specific things that we need to look at to see if we're getting enough salt, if we're getting too much salt, what's happening with the form of salt, and if it's necessarily going to be beneficial for some people and for others if they actually maybe need more or less. So essentially, we're going to have a bit of a debate here. We're going to have a conversation discussing in a very organic way how to choose whether you should be supplementing or adding salt into your diet and how to replenish salt as in its electrolyte form or in just in salt form in your foods. I think that's kind of how we're going to go with today.
Sounds good. I could probably have the debate just with myself.
Yes.
I'm on both sides of it. I haven't yet come to a final conclusion. And I think part of the reason for that is that we have to step away from the idea that one answer fits everybody. This is definitely one of those situations where it's a very individual question that you have to ask. But I do think that we talk a lot about ancient wisdom and things that we have just come to realize as a species over millennia. And now that we're so scientifically focused, we sort of throw out all that important knowledge that we had before and just assume that, everybody before we had the microscope knew nothing. And that's not true. They knew quite a bit, actually. In fact, most of the things that we're coming back to now are things that they knew before that we have to relearn. And so, sayings, it's in our vocabulary. Things like, you're worth your weight in salt. People use that saying. And, people who have I love the Italian, I'm going to butcher the Italian phrase of, a person who is sort of dull being pane nasa sale, or which I think translates to, bread without salt, So salt is one of the really, most important spices, been used in cooking. It's been used to store food. I mean, people, before they had refrigeration and freezers and the logistics to fly beef in from South America during the wintertime, we used to salt meat
Yes.
and and there's still dishes, sort of old recipes where you literally encrust something in salt.
Yeah.
So we can't assume that just salt is bad. It's got lots of uses. It's got lots of history. It's got lots of value. But I think it's very individual.
And anyone who has tasted a steak that is under-seasoned will agree that salt has a lot of benefit when it comes to the taste of food, I think. And that's really where a lot of this is going to come down to, is we're going to figure out there are some people that are absolutely on the side where they should not have any excess salt. They need to be really careful. They need to be on a hyponatremic diet. They need to make sure that they're not getting excess sodium for various reasons. We'll discuss a couple of those. And then there are people that maybe sweat a lot. Maybe they are much more active. They're athletes that are training numerous times a week and active 2 or 3 times a week in a performance sport. And they actually require real hydration. And I think hydration gets lumped in as just being water. And I think we need to twist that up, because when you're losing or being dehydrated through sweat, you're not just losing water. Water is actually the coming out because of the minerals. And anybody who has a sweaty hat brim that knows, and they see that white line that shows up on their dried out hat, just like I do, knows that you're releasing those salts, you're releasing these minerals out as you go. So let's start off with kind of the basics. Salt in itself in our modern society is eaten or consumed at a very high rate. The FDA recommendation is around 2,300, 2,400 milligrams daily. The current consumption rate, as it currently stands, is somewhere around 3,400 milligrams daily. So it's actually a gram higher than the FDA recommendations. Now, remember, with FDA recommendations, we're really generalizing, right? Every single person falls under, quote unquote, these FDA guidelines. But an athlete is very different than somebody who's kind of more sedentary lifestyle dealing with health conditions. So we can't be...
And people who eat processed foods a lot, which many people in the United States do, versus somebody who eats a lot of fresh food, a lot of natural whole foods, they're getting different sodium levels. And I just wanted to chime in here. Yes, the FDA has this 2,300 milligrams of salt recommendation per day, but there's a lot of literature that suggests that that's probably a gram lower than is actually healthy, and that there's ranges I've seen that say anywhere from 3,300 up to 5,000 milligrams. Now, that probably is more directed to people like, for example, I know, I've said it before, I run a lot. I run 10 miles a day, and I tend to sweat as a result of running, especially down here in Florida.
As you should.
And I come back home and, I have this bottle that I carry with me all the time, and it is constantly filling it. So I'm replenishing the water that I've lost, but I also am chronically hypotensive. Okay. Which means that if I'm lying down and I get up, I get a little lightheaded. Which means, and I know that my blood pressure is chronically low, and it's not unhealthy low. It's just that for me, I know that if I get my blood pressure checked, doctor usually does a double take. 56-year-old guy with blood pressure that's like 105 over 60, that's pretty low. That's kind of low. Now,
when it comes to blood pressure, for those who don't know, kind of the optimal area where you want to be is around that 110 over 70 number. Okay. That is optimal. We've often heard 120 over 80 as being good. That's actually at the top level of good and is almost in its current form considered maybe a little too high. We're more concerned about the diastolic number, which is the second number, the bottom number when it comes to blood pressure. The top number matters, but the top number is when the blood is flowing through the blood vessel with the pump occurring. When the pump is actually occurring, the blood vessel is being expanded or stretched. How much pressure is occurring during that pumping time? And that's the systolic number. That's that top number. And so that, if you're in the 130s, 140s, we know that the pressure is too high during that moment. We want to be in that 110 range as kind of the optimal, because 110 millimeters mercury, mmHg, is what we want to be at or around. Okay, so 110 is good systolic. But diastolic is when the pump isn't actually happening. So when the blood is just flowing generally through between pumps is what the diastolic number is telling us. And that's more like that's the baseline. And the baseline, if the baseline is high, that's a big problem. So what we want to make sure on the diastolic side of things is we're not generally above 80 on the diastolic. All right. So 120 over 80 is kind of that cutoff. Anything higher than that is telling us that we're leaning into a hypertensive environment. Hypertension being this higher blood pressure situation, meaning that the resilience of the blood vessels is significantly down. They're not able to relax and dilate to the level that we want them to. And so the pressure is too high.
Which is why stress drives people's blood pressure up. Because when you're stressed, you're changing how your blood vessels are flexing. You become much more rigid in your chest and abdomen. You're trying to pump blood out to your extremities in fight or flight because you need your limbs to have blood. And so you end up pumping more vigorously and through a more restricted blood vessel structure in your chest and abdomen out to those muscles. Now, the issue that I want to play the devil's advocate here because I think everything you said is right. Okay. A resting blood pressure.
Yes.
That is, you're sitting in a chair, you got a cuff on, you're not moving, you're not doing anything, and they're taking your blood pressure. You might be in the doctor's office, you might be a little stressed, so blood pressure is notoriously high in doctor's offices.
White coat hypertension, yes.
Exactly. White coat hypertension is exactly right. But think about your day. How often are you just sitting in a chair, not stressed, not doing anything, not actively, moving? Sort of like one of those cholesterol tests where you take and you get your lipid profile after a 12-hour fast. Okay, well, listen, I fast for 18 hours every day because I only eat during an 8-hour window, a 6-hour window usually. But truthfully, you're not really getting an accurate reflection of what your lipid profile is if you're only looking at it after a 12-hour fast. So the same thing is true. You're getting a profile of your blood pressure in a limited setting. It'd be great if we could measure blood pressure while you're running or while you're, negotiating a business deal or while you're driving your car on the highway. Those blood pressure measurements aren't being taken and they're not being averaged in. So you don't really know whether or not you're hypertensive or not unless you have a sense as to what your blood pressure profile looks like all the way through the day. And I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of people. I'm loath to believe that vast portions of the population are somehow defective. Okay, we do this with cholesterol. We say if your cholesterol level is over 150, that's actually unhealthy. Okay, you want to have a cholesterol level between 200 and 250. I'm sorry, that is just the truth. Okay, you want to have a cholesterol level between 200 and 250, which is where the vast majority of people will be. Okay, dietary cholesterol intake really matters not. It's only what your liver is producing, and your liver is producing the right amount for you. Okay, that's what if you're reasonably, even just reasonably healthy, it will do that. Same thing is true of your blood pressure. I just find it very difficult to believe that somehow we say there's 60 million people or 70 million people who have silent high blood pressure. And do they really? Or are they out of shape? If they're out of shape, let's fix they don't need to be medicated for blood pressure. They need to get in shape. If they get themselves back in shape, their blood pressure will regulate because their bodies aren't dysfunctional. Their bodies just need to get back into that state.
I think the best way to put this is hypertension, the silent hypertension, is not a disease in itself. It is a symptom of a lack of fitness to begin with, a lack of ability for the blood vessels to do the work that they need to do. We haven't taught the blood vessels to be stressed. We haven't given it the hormetic stressor of exercise or movement or day-to-day kind of, moving around your house. And generally, these people are far more sedentary, far less active, far less functional. When you're sitting, your blood is generally following gravity and falling down to your legs and staying around those blood vessels. And those blood vessels are having all the difficulty pumping because the veins in your legs utilize muscle movements to actually pump the blood back up to the heart. And when we don't move enough, we're not pumping that fluid back up, and that can cause the edema that occurs in a lot of people that have hypertension in their legs. Sadly, and this is something I see a lot. I travel quite a bit to different conferences. I sit around a lot of airports, and you see people sitting all the time. You're sitting at the gate for an hour before your flight, and then you're sitting on your flight for 3 to 4 hours, and you're not getting up and you're moving. And inevitably, there's going to be some form of edema or fluid buildup because you haven't given motion patterns. Now, if you give the exponential function of doing that every single day, 8, 10, 12, 14 hours a day that you're sitting, you're not moving, you're not going to be able to get that blood flow pumping effectively. It's the resilience of the blood vessel that needs to be taught, and movement and muscle functionality play a massive, massive role in that. And I know we've taken a detour away from salt, but I just wanted to make sure that we...
Well, they're related. I mean, at the end of the
100%.
day, if you're an active person, if you're outside, if you're sweating, if you're getting rid of, if you're having to replenish fluids and you're not replenishing with, minerals, including salt, you end up hypotensive. You end up with your electrolyte balance out of whack. And that can lead to all sorts of cardiac issues as well as blood pressure issues that need to be addressed sort of emergently. And it's just, much safer just to keep an eye on it. Electrolyte drinks have sodium in it. They're if you look at your Gatorade bottle, it's got sodium. Yeah. It's got salt in it. And but the idea is to replenish it, because you sweat it out, you start to lose functionality. You start losing the ability to do all the things that, dehydration is a very, very rapid way to sap your abilities, both physical and mental.
Yeah. And something that I'm a big fan of when it comes to this hydration piece and why salt and blood pressure matter. I think most people are able to put this together. I'm just going to simply put one statement out there. Water follows minerals. Minerals, Na, sodium, chloride, Na plus, Cl minus, right? We have potassium and we have magnesium, which are the main 4 electrolytes, main 4 minerals in these electrolyte powders and salts, particularly NaCl, sodium chloride. But those are the prime drivers of where water flows. So if you have enough salt in your blood vessels, water will flow in and it will form the fluid component of blood. And the reason why high sodium diets and in combination with a lack of movement tend to result in a hypertensive environment is because there's too much salt being taken in for the level of activity that's being put in. And that is why people result in having a hypertensive blood vessel situation. And that is where a lot of people have this quote unquote silent hypertension or hypertension that's not noted. So it's the mineral that goes in. So if you have a high sodium diet, but you're not utilizing the musculature, you're not utilizing and maintaining good blood vessel resilience, that's where hypertension occurs. We see this with, I mentioned earlier, the sweat, right? The brim of your hat that has that white line on it. Your body is pushing salt out for water to follow it. And that is what pulls and draws water out, which is why we then sweat. So sweating is dehydration, or essentially taking the water out with the intent of evaporating the water, thus taking the heat off of you to cool your body temperature down. And so there's a few different bodily processes that are requiring of good salt levels. Sweating is a huge one. Kidney functionality is a massive area. So as your kidneys become more dysfunctional, they're actually going to release more sodium or hold on to more sodium. And that's going to result in blood pressure issues. And maybe a release of too much sodium is going to result in dehydration. It's going to result in a lot of other issues. So kidneys and sweating, I think, are the top 2. Any other ones that I'm forgetting there?
Digestion is also,
yes.
Moves a lot of water. But I would say, just to add on to what you're saying, and not to get too technical, but if people can remember back to their chemistry class, there was something called osmotic pressure.
Yes.
Okay. And what you were describing is that if you have a cell, there's fluid outside the cell and there's fluid inside the cell. Okay. So the cell is trying to regulate how much water is inside the cell versus outside the cell. If there's salt inside the cell, then there is a tendency through this osmotic pressure for water to want to move into the cell to dilute the salt levels down to the point where it's equivalent on either side of the cell membrane. Now, the cell needs salt more than the outside does. So it needs to maintain some level of pressure. Because these are ions, they've got charges. So there's actually a charge difference between both sides of the cell membrane. So that balance, if there's too much salt in the system, that can be dysregulating to the cell size, cell function, and frankly, it can also dysregulate, everything that's going on inside the cell, from energy generation to protein creation to functions in the nucleus with respect to copying and transcribing and ultimately translating genetic information. Calcium is also a very important mineral. So you've got calcium, you've got sodium, you've got potassium, and frankly, even the recommended daily intakes of sodium chloride and potassium chloride are about the same. So you are trying to bring in these minerals. And if you just drink, we're all talking about filtered water and how filtered water is so much better than tap water. It is, but it's not such a bad idea to drop a little bit of an electrolyte, either pill that will dissolve or powder. Those things are not bad. Just monitor the amount that you're taking in and make certain that you're not taking in an excessive amount. And if you're not exercising and sweating it out, then maybe you minimize that amount, versus if you're a heavy exerciser or you're out in the sun just for your job outside, be aware. You need that. You need that extra kick.
You're absolutely right. When we first wake up in the morning, our bodies generally are more dehydrated. We've been not taking anything in through the overnight period, ideally. We are generally in a state of mild dehydration. And one of the health hacks that a lot of biohackers and influencers recommend, with good science behind it, I think, is having a little bit of water with lemon and salt in it first thing in the morning. Now, not necessarily going and dropping a gram of salt or sodium in right off the bat, but a pinch of salt initially to help get things started. I've personally found to be very beneficial, and I do recommend this to patients as well, particularly those that are not dealing with hypertensive issues. But just getting water in, getting that rehydration going first thing in the morning, I think is actually really helpful for a lot of people. So on a case-by-case basis, I will make that recommendation. I just got off a call with somebody this morning who uses it for maintaining good bowel movements, maintaining kind of that initiation of release of
Waste.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the best way to put it. So digestion does follow this, right?
It helps move your peristaltic motion, which is what you need. I know that you, because we've talked about it before, don't necessarily like to drink water or drink fluids while eating. And the reason for that is you want to maintain the acid level in your stomach so that when you take in food, you're digesting it relatively quickly and efficiently. And you need that high acid level because human beings eat a lot of bacteria and other things that need to be cleaned out or killed off in the stomach. But by the same token, you want to make certain that at least either prior to eating or after you've eaten, you do hydrate well enough, because it's important for peristaltic motion. I mean, we've all experienced it. What happens when you get dehydrated? You can get constipated. Okay. You want to have that fluid because digestion, the digestive process, uses up a lot of water. And not to put too fine a point on it, but what comes out of you is typically a higher water concentration than what goes into you.
I believe it's actually about 66% of what's released in your feces is water, which is a pretty significant amount, right? And yeah, I'm a big component of that is releasing water-soluble toxins that need to be excreted from the body. The liver releases the toxins that it is breaking through and getting rid of into the bile salts, into the bile. That fluid makes its way into the gut, and that adds to the water-soluble toxins that are released via the feces, via the stools. So that is a huge piece of the puzzle, and that's why actually stools are about 66% water. So if you are dehydrated, you're absolutely right. One of the most common signs of dehydration is constipation. Absolutely. Now, when it comes to who should be adding more salt into their diet. We've kind of talked about this a little bit, but let's be really particular about this. We know that if you sweat a lot, you're going to want to replete. You're going to want to increase your sodium and other electrolyte intake, salt intake as well. So athletes are amongst the top level people that should be repleting electrolytes really effectively. Outdoor workers, people that are working outdoors, particularly in hotter environments. One of the best ways to hydrate in those environments is a natural way of hydrating using things like coconut water, which are naturally high in these minerals and able to get them in, not super high in sodium, but very high in the potassium and magnesium, which are really great for the replenish piece. And as we learned from Dr. Stephen Hussey last time, that potassium is able to enter water and get in through that structured water piece, the H3O2 structured water, which will at least at some point in the next few episodes try to get into a little more. Potassium can, sodium cannot. So that structured water, almost that gel-like feeling of something like a coconut jelly, is structured water, form of water as well. So that's a way to get hydration into your body. Who else should be using electrolytes? When you're working out, anybody who does a workout that is generally going to sweat, like JP, when you do your runs. For me personally, I throw electrolytes into my water when I'm doing my weight training. It's absolutely something that I travel with. I have my little pouch on the side of my backpack that contains my sticks of electrolytes. And I think those are necessary. And so is there anybody else you can think of that would require or should be using electrolytes?
Well, I mean, I think those are the biggies. I mean, people who are shift workers, I think also have some consequences of the dysregulation of their sleep schedule that can experience certain electrolyte imbalances. I'm not really certain as to why that is, but it is in the literature that those people have to just be aware of it and keep track of it.
My thought process on this is it may be around the temperature regulation, because in ideal situation, we should be having our body temperature drop at night while we're sleeping, and electrolytes are going to help to dictate a lot of that via the kidneys, via sweat. So body temperature regulation is partially done with electrolytes as being a piece to this, or the minerals involved in the salts.
I suspect that vegetarians, it's not something that I'm, personally experiencing, but I would imagine that there are higher concentrations of salt typically in obviously seafood and in meat versus plants. So I would imagine that people who are vegetarians may need to supplement their at least sodium intake. I don't know about potassium. I suspect that potassium is not a problem. And if you choose the right foods, magnesium you'll get through the right green leafy vegetables and things like that. But I think pure sodium chloride might be something that vegetarians need to be aware of.
Yeah, that's a good point as well. I think that is covering the majority of people that should be taking some sort of salt supplementation. And in addition, I'll just add in people that know that they are hypotensive, meaning that they have low blood pressure. So low resting blood pressure, if you notice you have issues when you're getting up or you're laying down, just postural orthostatic type issues where these challenges are popping up, where you get up and you have this massive drop in your blood pressure, likely there's a dehydration involved or a sodium depletion that's involved. And so adding in some supplementation could be beneficial. All of that said, there are people that should not be adding salt into their diet. So off the top of my head, I'm going to say people that obviously have hypertension right off the bat. Number one, let's not start by adding salt back into your diet. Let's start by adding movement, fitness, just going for a walk in general as being a major part of this.
Yes, but keep in mind that hypertension is such a large group of people that are being diagnosed with it that we have to divide it up into different groups. There are salt sensitive hypertensive people, and they're clearly people who should be lowering their salt. For whatever reason, their salt transporters in their body are not functioning properly. But then most people who have hypertension are typically referred to as what's referred to as essential hypertension. And when you talk about essential hypertension, another term for it would be idiopathic hypertension, where we don't really know why you're hypertensive. We have modern pharmaceutical science has come up with certain interventions that they try on you, things like angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE inhibitors, blockers of this important enzyme in your body. There's also ARBs and other medications that are attempting to intervene in the processing of the enzymes that regulate salt in your bloodstream. The thing that is more closely tied to your hypertensive episodes or your essential hypertension is insulin. In fact, people who are blood pressure specialists, both cardiologists as well as renal physicians, they are very interested in what your insulin levels are, because they used to refer to essential hypertension as insulin dependent hypertension. And so what you really need to do is find a way to regulate your insulin levels. And that means cutting out sugar. It means cutting out carbs. It's why high blood pressure is part of the entire metabolic syndrome cascade that comes from being overweight. It leads to, one of the things we haven't talked about, which I think we need to go back and talk about briefly, is the correlation between hypertension and that stiffness in the arteries that you were talking about, that lack of flexibility, the autonomic nervous system, and how being in that chronic fight or flight state leads to that effectively a stiffening of the major arteries that are in your trunk and your abdomen, and atherosclerosis. Okay, atherosclerosis is the development of clots in your arteries and other things. We talked about that, with Stephen Hussey. One of the things that is a trigger for the process where you get these occlusions developing in the sidewall of the artery is hypertension. That when there's stiffness in the artery and you've got this high pressure pulse coming through, or a constant high pressure with the diastolic measurement, you end up getting damage to the interior lining of the blood vessel. And that damage leads to what's referred to as a fatty streak. Okay, what is that fatty streak? It's the deposition of fat trying to heal that damaged lining of the vessel, that endothelial lining. And cholesterol is part of the healing process. And so you end up with this cascade of trying to heal. It's almost like a scar that's developing as a result of hypertension. So again, where's that coming from? Elevated sugar. I mean, sugar is really bad for causing proteins and cells to clump together, which is part of that clotting process that we talked about, again, in the context of atherosclerosis. So it all goes together. Insulin levels high because of sugar and carbohydrates leads to blood vessel damage, and it leads to hypertension. So you really want to regulate your hypertension. It's less, oftentimes, especially if it's essential hypertension, is less about regulating your your salt, and it's more about regulating your sugar and more about regulating your insulin levels.
I agree. I completely agree with you on that. Sugar is far more important to note and to be really conscious of. And I think salt gets a bad rap because of what sugar is actually doing. And so maybe salt isn't quite as bad as we initially thought it was, or has been portrayed in the media for the last while.
I think that's probably true, much the same way cholesterol has been vilified. And we're finding out that the recommendation to have your cholesterol level below 150 is actually unhealthy. You should have a higher level. I suspect that the idea of saying 2,300 milligrams of sodium is all you're supposed to get, I suspect that that's a target that they're putting out there because they know that nobody's going to reach it.
Yeah.
But I would rather give people the honest truth and say, listen, if you're a healthy person, depending on how much activity you've got, 3,300 to 5,000 milligrams is more appropriate. It's probably you're going to find yourself having some negative symptoms if you really withhold your sodium levels down to the what's recommended. I think you're actually going to end up having some deficit associated with that.
I would be remiss if I didn't bring up, when you talked about the stiffening of the arteries, if I didn't bring up nitric oxide, the importance of nitric oxide being present to enable the dilation of the blood vessels, the loosening, the softening, and getting rid of that stiffness within the blood vessels. As we age, our ability to produce nitric oxide through that endothelial nitric oxide synthase enzyme, which is present in the endothelial cells, that decreases. That happens because of oxidative stress sugar being the major driver of that, is going to be decreased. The eNOS enzyme actually uncouples. And so your ability to produce nitric oxide decreases, meaning that you have less flexibility, less of that flow and movement of dilation within the blood vessel, leading to the stiffening, which is then what leads down the path to atherosclerosis and whatnot. So keep in mind, nitric oxide piece is huge. And I would just want to say a very interesting thing. I've been taking my Berkeley Life products, the nitric oxide foundations, for the last 6 months pretty consistently. I had my blood pressure taken yesterday, and for the first time ever, my body is actually in optimal blood pressure state, which was crazy. My blood pressure yesterday was 112/60. My doctor was in shock. And it was this change. This is literally the only change I've made over the last 6 months with regards to supplementing something. My nitric oxide levels have improved my blood pressure very clearly. So maybe it's not salt that's increasing blood pressure, but rather sugar that's causing the oxidative stress that's reducing nitric oxide that's resulting in blood pressure changes being the issue. And we're attributing it to salt because salt does have a hypertensive effect. It absolutely will increase blood pressure, but the blood pressure increase is more of a result of the blood vessel, not necessarily the fluid itself in the vessel.
Yeah, and how resilient you are to salt intake is a function of what we've been talking about: autonomic nervous system, nitric oxide levels, your insulin levels, your sugar levels. I mean, all of those things play into how resilient you are to salt changes. I've been involved in animal studies where we've looked at cerebral aneurysms, okay? And there's no question, if you want to cause cerebral aneurysms and cause them to burst, one of the things that you do is you put the animal on a high salt diet. But that's not the only thing you do. The other thing you have to do, it's not just the high salt, because a wild type healthy animal is going to be able to regulate that. What you have to do to cause the problem of the cerebral aneurysm is you have to use what's called elastase. Elastase is an enzyme that starts to break down the strength and the resilience of that artery or your blood vessels, so that the arteries in your central nervous system will start to have bubbles form, where instead of being just a simple tube, it's got this bubbling out section, which is the aneurysm. And then if it bursts, then you have a problem. So if you have cerebral aneurysm already, then you definitely want to keep a low salt diet if you have a cerebral aneurysm, or you're even at risk of them. But the best way to not be at risk of having them is to make certain that you're metabolically healthy. So it, again, circles back to that. Now, one of the things, and the reason why I find it interesting is in the studies, what we looked at was, and it always comes back to vagus nerve stimulation, how vagus nerve stimulation impacted cerebral aneurysms. And this was really a fascinating study done at Harvard, at Mass General. What we did was we used, again, elastase and a high salt diet to induce cerebral aneurysms. And then with some frequency, they would burst. And we did two groups. One was a really high salt diet. And those animals would have their cerebral aneurysms burst. And if they weren't being treated with anything, they died or had significant neurologic deficits. Okay. The group that received vagus nerve stimulation, they still had some bursts, but they generally survived them, and the neurologic deficit they had was less. Now, in the low group, the question was, could we prevent them from bursting entirely? And could we prevent the cerebral aneurysms from occurring? And the answer was, with vagus nerve stimulation, we were able to do that. We were able to minimize, and in fact, what we saw was, if there were any cerebral aneurysms that burst, they had no deficits. So, I mean, imagine having that. It was a pretty remarkable study. And, unfortunately, to do that kind of study in the real world in humans is almost impossible. You obviously can't cause cerebral aneurysms in humans. But it's a pretty frightening statistic if you look at the number of Americans who actually have cerebral aneurysms that they're living with. That is, blood vessels in the brain that have bubbled out and are sitting, I won't call them ticking time bombs, but they are aneurysms that are sort of silently sitting in the brain. Among hypertensive people, it's about 8%. We're talking about 1 in 12 people. I mean, that's millions of people who are sitting in the United States with either undetected or as of yet detected but unburst cerebral aneurysms. Now, it's a very low chance that they're going to burst. But I don't know. That seems like, I don't know. If somebody handed me a revolver that had, even about 100 chambers and only one bullet, I'm still not putting that up to my head and pulling the trigger. And if you've got this, why would you not? Based just on the animal data, why would you not start using vagus nerve stimulation on a daily basis? Because if nothing else, it's an insurance policy that in the event that that bursts, you're going to have a better chance of surviving it and maybe surviving it without any neurological damage. And again, the clinical studies haven't been done other than the animal studies, but it's such a low risk. Why not do it?
The aneurysm story, the cerebral specific aneurysm story, hits a little close to home for me. One of my best friends from chiropractic college, his wife passed when an aneurysm burst, leaving him with 2 very young children and a whole life without his wife anymore. So that was just almost 2 years ago, which was a very challenging time for my best friend. And it's still challenging, but it's something that 1 in 12 people with hypertension are dealing with. And generally, you don't know that you have an aneurysm until it's too late, which is unfortunate, which is why we really want to work to be more resilient. We want to work to build up that resilience in our blood vessels, in every single tissue in our body, right? Because none of us wants to either be a burden or be a health challenge to the loved ones around us. And we want to be here generally to support our families and to be as present and capable as we want to be. And so I think more than anything, let's do our best to get people healthy, right? And I realize I'm going a little off track here, but the whole point of this conversation is how can we get to be healthier? How can we allow for salt to not be the foe or the thing that we're worried about and we're vilifying, because often it's not the cause of these health problems. And I think that is the overarching theme of what salt is. Salt is not the problem. It contributes when the factors are in place, when the issues are occurring already in the blood vessel, that salt will potentially create a greater opportunity for a burst aneurysm or for the atherosclerosis situation to really pop up more. But it's not the cause. Salt doesn't cause it in the first place. And that's really, really important to note.
Yeah, no, farmers put out salt for their animals to lick. I mean, it's a salt lick. And the reason why you do that is because they recognize that the animals thrive if they have more salt. I mean, salt actually, believe it or not, salt was actually considered a form of money. It was a currency for hundreds of, if not thousands of years. If you had a bag of salt, it was money. I mean, that could be traded for gold because it was that important. And it's not just because it tastes good, okay? And the fact that it even does taste good. We are exquisitely evolved to, when we taste something, if it tastes good, tastes nutritious, it probably is. The problem is how much is available to us because we live in a society where it's so plentiful. Listen, sugar tastes good, but sugar used to be exceedingly difficult to get. Okay, bears go after honeybees, hives to get to the honey, and they withstand thousands of stings to get to that honey. Okay, they're willing to do it because it's nutritious. Okay, they get something from it, but it isn't plentiful. We have so much sugar, we're drowning in it. And literally, we're drowning our health in sugar in the modern society. You could do the same thing with salt. You can overdo it. But I think the more important thing is how resilient you are. If you run 10 miles a day, as I do, you can eat sugar. You can eat carbohydrates. I choose not to. I choose not to indulge in that, but you can. What you can't do is eat that and then be sedentary. So it's sort of like with great power comes great responsibility. If you are going to indulge in those things, then you have to take on the responsibility of being super active. If you want to, overindulge in salt, well, then you better overindulge in sweating, over-index the sweating side of it. If you're not going to do that, then it's in moderation. Do things in moderation and you'll be healthy. I find personally that if something has a certain amount of salt, it tastes better. It's got too much salt, it doesn't taste good anymore. And the reason for that is because there's a sweet spot. Shouldn't say sweet spot.
A
Salty
salty spot.
and and there's a level to which I like it, and beyond that it's too much, and my body knows that, and it's telling me because I'm sensing, okay, that would be too much. And in fact, if I eat something that's salty and I've been dehydrated, a salty thing of macadamia nuts after being outside and running tastes great, okay, but first thing in the morning I'd be like, "Bah, that's too salty," or late at night after I've already had a big meal. It's like, no, maybe I'll have a handful, but that's it. So listen to your body, and that's most of the time it's a pretty good way of telling you what your body needs is how does it taste.
I think that is such an important point here, and one that we can, on an individualized basis, work to do a little bit more of. And that is listen to what your body is trying to tell you, right? Yes, sugar tastes great, but is it actually helping you? Do you notice that you have more energy 2 hours after you've eaten that candy bar or whatever it is? Generally, no, you're crashing because your body is telling you that you didn't need that and you're not utilizing it in the right way. Right. I have a couple of great mentors, Charles Poliquin and Ben Pakulski. They're out there and they're saying carbs need to be earned. Like you need to earn your carbohydrates. If you're going to have them, you have to do the work to earn them. And I completely agree with that. The other side of this is listen to what your body's saying. If the salt tastes good at a certain level, then that's the amount that your body is saying you kind of need. Right. And the food tastes better when it's seasoned effectively. Seasoning is the number one thing in all cooking shows that my wife watches on Food Network. Is this over seasoned? Is this under seasoned? What's happening with the seasoning? Can you get to that balance point that works well for the taste of that dish, but also for the individual? And so each individual is going to have a preference as to how much salt they want to take in. So be really conscious of this on an individual basis. Take that information in and make the decision on your own salt intake based on what your body is telling you. Look at your blood work. Look at your blood pressure findings, your hypertension findings. On the blood work markers, look at your sodium and potassium and magnesium levels and see that they're not too high or too low. They should ideally be in an optimal zone for each individual. So use those markers, use these biomarkers to help you decide whether more salt or less salt is going to be beneficial for you. Look at your blood pressure, look at your HRV, look at your vagus nerve function, right? Your digestion, and take all of those into account and make a decision on an individual basis. I think for me, my concluding fact on this entire topic is that rarely is salt the initiating cause or root cause of any health issue. It's never the cause. There's usually some underlying issue that's occurred, some oxidative stress, some uncontrolled inflammation, lack of vagus nerve function, lack of resilience that's there to begin with. And salt just exacerbates that problem when it's done in excess. And so it's never truly the cause of the problem. And in fact, it's actually really good for you when you do it in the right way, when you listen to your body and take it in effectively, like when I travel or work out.
100% agree. In fact, maybe as we start to conclude this topic, I'm just going to say, with respect to hypertension, you're absolutely right. Salt isn't the cause. Salt may exacerbate the problem if you have a specific type of hypertension, but it's probably more likely, and if you talk to people who have hypertension, they'll tell you they've got a lot of stress in their lives. They're not managing their stress well. Those things we talk about, I must have a blood pressure spike because I'm so stressed. Well, I will tell you that I had two colleagues, actually one on the board of directors and one as one of the C-suite members at electroCore, both of whom were hypertensive, both of whom were on medication, in one case for 2 decades and one for at least half a decade. And both of them, after seeing the data that was coming in from our clinical studies where we were measuring these things, not as the primary endpoint, but as just data that we were collecting, we were seeing people who were maybe not even diagnosed hypertensive, but our measurements on the intake form showed that they were borderline hypertensive. And we saw how well those patients who went on vagus nerve stimulation saw their blood pressure regulate. If you're normotensive, if you don't have high blood pressure, but you take blood pressure medication, you will become hypotensive. It will force you down to the point where your blood pressure is too low. Okay. Now, vagus nerve stimulation didn't do that. it took the people who were hypertensive or borderline hypertensive and moved them down into the normotensive range, but it didn't do anything to push the normotensive people down into a negative state. In fact, we saw people who were hypotensive sort of start to rise back up into the normotensive range. And so both of them went on and started using the device to regulate their blood pressure. So they were still just using it twice a day. Both of them found that their blood pressure became regulated. The one who was on medication for 20 years was able to lower his dose, go off one of the two medications he was on and only use one. The other one, who had been hypertensive for 5 or 6 years, went off all of his medications. And the funny thing is, he went to the doctor about 6 months later, and the doctor, took his blood pressure and said, "Oh, this is great. This is wonderful. Your blood pressure is, really good." And he said, "Well, I certainly got there not by using, the medication. I'm off all medications." And the doctor just looked at him and was like, "That's not possible." He said, "Yeah, it is. It is possible. I know." So, if you're out there and you've got hypertension and you're listening to this because it's important for you, and you've gotten to this point in the show, or you know somebody who has hypertension where they have these problems, give vagus nerve stimulation a try. It may be the difference maker. I can tell you that what we saw in terms of the numbers, what it did for people who were hypertensive was, if I remember correctly, it was a 14/9 drop in blood pressure on average for the hypertensive people. So if you were at 134, it brought you down to 120. If you were at 89, it brought you down to 80. So it got you back down to that 120/80, which is at the high end of the range. But in other cases, it moved it down even further. So, listen, your ARBs and your ACE inhibitors, they hope to have those kind of impacts. So, yeah. And if you do choose to take this advice and you start using vagus nerve stimulation and you see a regulation in your blood pressure, send us a message. Tell us about it. If you have a great story, we'd love to get you on the show. Have an opportunity. I think we're planning in the near future, not in the next couple episodes, but in the near future, to have a whole bunch of people on as, to tell their stories, and we'll do a compilation episode of a whole bunch of people who've had remarkable effects, whether it's on their epilepsy or on their stress levels or on their sleep or on asthma or on, an autoimmune disease. We're going to have a group of people come on and tell you their stories.
I think that would be awesome. And I'm excited to share all these stories with as many people as we can. And so we didn't get to talk about iodized salt, table salt. We didn't get to talk about the forms of salt as well, that all the different types that have potential microplastics and heavy metals in them. And that's a whole nother episode that we can definitely dig into that. But I think in general, we can say, I wouldn't say conclusively, but I would say with a high degree of confidence that salt is more friend than foe. And maybe there's something else that needs to be looked at and adjusted and supported first, rather than just putting it all on salt being the problem. So great way to end today's episode. If you got to this point in the episode, share it with 1, 2, 3 people who you think could use this information to help reduce their hypertension and help reduce their health issues, and ideally live a more upgraded life. Have a wonderful day, and we'll see you all in the next one.